and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Fully Batibo. It's been 3 years since the start of the Syrian conflict. What began with peaceful demonstrations in the streets of Daraa has morphed into a nationwide conflict with sectarian, ethnic and regional consequences. A regime that has run Syria for decades is fighting for its survival and is in no mood to compromise. On the opposition side, a group of desperate forces are united by the common goal of defeating the rule of Bashar al-Assad. An uprising that was inspired by the Arab Spring is now its most violent conflict, threatening to destabilize an already turbulent Middle East. It's a situation with no end in sight, and its impact is likely to last for generations. And after 3 years of conflict, what's obvious is that it's the Syrian people who continue to suffer. So let's take a look at what these years of war have cost the country and its people. Since the start of the unrest in March of 2011, more than 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed. The conflict has also created the world's worst refugee crisis in 20 years. More than 2 million Syrians have fled from the country, seeking refuge in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq and Egypt. The UN believes that that number could top 3 million by the end of this year. And the number of people displaced from their homes has risen to 6.5 million. Many are living without adequate food or access to electricity and medical supplies. So, to assess the current situation, the possible outcomes and the next steps, we're joined by our 3 guests. From the U.S. state of Oklahoma, Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma. In the Bulgarian capital, Sofia, Amr Al-Azam, Associate Professor of Middle East and History Anthropology at Shawnee State University in the U.S. state of Ohio. And here in Doha, Majub Zweri, Professor of Modern and Contemporary History of Middle East at Qatar University. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Syria. If I can start with you, Joshua Landis. First of all, your assessment, 3 years on, is either side winning this war?
Well, what we have really is the worst of all worlds in Syria. It's turning out to look like it's going to be worse than Iraq, worse than Lebanon. All sides have become radicalized as the stalemate goes deeper and deeper. The Assad regime, the language now of calling their opponents rats, takfiris, Saudi pigs, this sort of language, completely othering and devastating entire neighborhoods of cities in order to clear out opposition. It's very hard to see how they can possibly assert their power. The religious minorities, on the one hand, clinging to Bashar al-Assad, and on the other, Arab Sunnis, who've also become terribly radicalized. Talking about, the leaders came out recently of the Islamic Front, the biggest coalition of the opposition, saying we reject democracy, we wanted Islamic rule, to impose Islamic rule over the state, and talking about najis, the impurity of the Alawites and so forth, that they're going to be wiped from Syria. So we have 2 sides locked in this, this struggle, and you can't see a way out. The people who are going to be sacrificed in this clash of titans are the Syrian people. Right. And the international community has thrown up its hands.
Right. The Syrian people are indeed suffering. If I can ask you, Amr Al-Azam in Bulgaria, as a Syrian, who do you blame most for the situation that your country finds itself in today? Is it the Assad regime? Is it the Syrian opposition? Or is it the international community that bears responsibility for what's happening, for the predicament that Syria finds itself in?
I think it's an indication of where we are now that we even ask the question of who is to blame. I think that is very reflective of where we are today. I mean, obviously, the Assad regime must carry a very significant amount of the blame because in its escalation of in its dealing with the initial protests, its excessive use of violence to suppress the protests when they first came out, when it could have been possible to negotiate a peaceful outcome. But then this was never part of the Assad regime's narrative or way of doing things. The regime's playbook always demanded that any opposition, any deviation from the path that the Assad regime has laid out must be crushed, and crushed totally. And so the Assad regime will carry a significant part of the blame. I would also, blame the international community for once it was clear where this was, how this whole set of events was unfolding, not to take the necessary assertive action that would have been needed to bring this very sorry state of affairs to a close much earlier. And finally, I would also place some of the blame on the opposition for failing to create the necessary vision from quite early on that it would have attracted many of the Syrians that are still sitting in the middle and have not yet declared their position either side, and also in convincing the international community that they can be a real and viable alternative to the Assad regime. And this is something that the Assad regime has capitalized on, has incorporated in its narrative, and has used quite effectively to counter the opposition's claims that they represent the people, not the Assad regime.
Let me just ask you this before I move on to Mahjoub Zouairi. When you speak to your friends and family back in Syria today, what do they want? What would they rather see happen today? Would they rather have Bashar al-Assad stay in power and have peace? Or, what does the future look like in their eyes?
I mean, for them and for everybody else, the future looks bleak. I mean, everybody says, when is this going to be over? When are we going to be done? When are you going to get done? I mean, I've heard this said to me by close friends and family, where they'll say, can't you guys sort of finish this and then we can get back to our lives? But not only people in Syria. Now, you see, this crisis is no longer containable within Syria. It is spread across borders into Lebanon, into Iraq, and certainly into Turkey and other places. I was on a plane flying into Beirut a few days ago, and I was sitting next to a Lebanese businessman who said, our economy can no longer take this. He said, how long do you think this is going to take? And I said, oh, maybe another 10 years. And he was aghast. He went pale, and he said, we'll collapse, we'll be destroyed before this.
Indeed, a lot of countries are bearing the brunt of what's happening in Syria, like Lebanon, like Turkey and Iraq, of course. Mahjoub Zouairi, where do you see this conflict heading? What does the future look like for Syria? Are we in for 3-5 more years, or is a solution in sight?
I mean, it's important to put what's happening in Syria in the right context. The right context that it was a revolution in the context of what's so-called Arab Spring. That revolution started a little bit late, 3-4 months after what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, Libya. So basically, this is an event which has been, taking place. In that context, there was a demand for change, a demand for democracy, a demand for freedom. All of this, demands, the response was using tough hand against the people, and basically the reaction is the international community first did not take seriously the demand of people. Secondly, they rely on the power of the regime, where basically they can, the regime can calm down the situation and bring people homes, where, even with killing thousands of people. The absence of international community or the lack of international will is to be blamed first.
Why do you think that lack of will? You mentioned Libya. Why do you think the international community and Western nations in particular have not been as forthcoming and involved when it comes to Syria?
For two reasons. One, the geopolitics of Syria, where basically it was important, close to Israel, close to Europe. There are major elements that should be taken into consideration. The second element is the role of Russia. Russia has hijacked the whole role of international community by using veto on 3 stages at least, and delaying any kind of solution in the Security Council. So basically, the role of Russia can be looked at seriously, and should be looked at seriously as a reason behind, I would say, delaying any kind of solution in Syria. Of course, the United States and European nations, they were also delaying or not contributing positively to the solution in different fronts.
Joshua Landis, do you agree with that? Do you agree with Mahjoub when he says that Russia, basically the role of Russia within the international community is why we haven't seen more involvement from the US, for instance? Or are there perhaps other elements that we have to take into account, like national interest, US national interest? Are the US not as interested in Syria than they were in Libya?
Well, the U.S. unfortunately has never been interested in Syria. In '48 war, we sided with Israel, and that forced the Syrians to move towards the Soviet bloc. They needed arms to fight Israel, and the U.S., of course, wouldn't give them to them. And that forced, and we helped Turkey and NATO, we helped Iraq and the Baghdad Pact. Syria was always the stepchild of international relations. Nobody cared about it very much. Everybody saw it as a viper's nest of constant coups and counter coups. So Syria has never counted for much. We've had sanctions. The United States has had sanctions on Syria for almost 30 years, over 30 years. There's no trade. Syria is a black hole for the United States. And after Iraq, after Afghanistan, the United States has spent trillions of dollars trying to sort out the national problems. You know, it's easy to blame the international community, but the Syrians have to figure out a way to live together. And I think the international community, in many ways, is right to believe that they cannot fix Syria.
Right.
The Syrians dislike the United States. They've accused the United States of many things, imperialism, colonialism, and it's understandable why the international community does not think it can fix the Syrian family problems the way we could not fix Iraq. We couldn't fix Lebanon. Those are still boiling, and nobody in the Levant, in the Middle East, has found a good way to live together. Not the Jews and the Arabs, nobody. And this is the problem. You begin to despair.
Okay, well, let's just take a look at what the U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice had to say about the Syrian civil war, how she summed up the 3 years of civil war in Syria. She said, "This is not a genocide. It's a horrific civil war. At the end of the day, unless there is a political solution, this thing is not going to be resolved. It's not going to be resolved on the battlefield. We have every interest to end this conflict," she says, "but in a way that does not insert the United States back into a hot conflict in the Middle East." So it seems like the U.S. doesn't have a solution to this conflict. What do you see today as the solution? Do you think a diplomatic solution can still work? Can they still agree politically, you think, the different sides in this crisis?
Look, I mean, there's a serious problem here in terms of how this whole crisis has been handled. I mean, I know from speaking to U.S. officials and people who are involved in decision making in the United States, that their position has always been, or they followed a containment strategy. There's this false belief that somehow this crisis is containable within the borders, and as long as it's containable, then the U.S. can afford to essentially, with very little input on its part, serious input on or any involvement, somehow allow this problem to resolve itself until the Syrians somehow manage to, as Joshua mentioned, figure out a way to live with each other. The problem is this problem is not containable, and therefore, the United States and the European states and even the regional states around cannot afford to ignore the problem in Syria. And the real issue here is that the regime, until this regime is convinced that it cannot survive unless it goes to the negotiating table, then it will continue to follow a military approach, or it will follow a military solution to its problem. And there are those within the opposition that also believe that this is only solvable militarily. And as long as those two groups are essentially in the driving seat, and there's no will or no effort on the international community's part to deter this or to prevent either side from essentially following this path, then the diplomatic solution is off the table. And the failure of Geneva is a clear example of why this happened.
Right.
Essentially, the regime, in its calculus, it can win, and the Russians weren't willing to persuade the regime otherwise, and so the talks failed because there is no deterrence.
Joshua, let me ask you this on the failure of Geneva. There are many who say that it's the Russian position that contributed to the failure of the Geneva peace process. Russia and the West, we know, are now at loggerheads over the situation in Ukraine, in Crimea. What impact do you see the Ukraine crisis having on Russia's Syria policy?
Well, the West looks at Russia as an aggressor in Ukraine. Obviously, Russia, unfortunately, sees itself as the loser, that it's lost Ukraine. It's trying to keep the Crimea, which is ethnically Russia, which has a history of being close to Russia. And it's going to cling on to Syria, I think, all the more in order to draw this line, not to see Russian power deteriorate and see its borders retract, in a sense, its symbolic borders. And so Syria is very important. Russia has clearly laid down the law in Syria and said, we're going to fight for Syria. I don't think they're going to back away from it now. And they certainly see no U.S. determination to win in Syria. This is not a Cold War. The U.S. has forfeited Syria to Russia, largely, and they're going to sit on the sidelines.
So the diplomacy is not working for the moment. So a lot of people have been talking about the idea of partition. Well, let's take a look. Syria is and has always been a largely multi-ethnic nation. And these ethnic groups will need to bridge the deep divisions among them and prevent even greater sectarian unrest if the Assad government were to fall. Let's just run you through some of these groups in Syria right now. The Sunni Arabs make up 74% of Syria's total population. That includes Sunni Kurds. The Alawites, a branch of Shia Islam to which President Assad belongs, roughly account for 13% of Syria's population of 22 million. 10% of the population is Christian and 3% is Druze. But these figures may have changed given the huge exodus of refugees into neighboring countries and, importantly, given the swelling numbers of foreign fighters who are coming into Syria. Mahjoub Zouairi, the people who say there is no other solution today than the partition of Syria, do you agree with them?
Of course, I don't agree. The theory of having a pure society did not exist and will never exist. Always societies are mixed, and any discussion over, dividing Syria or having, parts of Syria, depend on ethnic or religious groups. This is not the theory which can be sold to anyone. Basically, it's the politics. This is a revolution. This is a new stage where this revolution is being militarized by the regime first, where the reaction basically was very clear. So any debate on this kind of idea, Syria will be divided, is actually is part of delaying the solution, trying to confirm or try to sell the idea that there is no change in this region unless the society is being divided. This was the case in Iraq, and this was also the case in Iran. The debate on Iran after the war in Iraq 2003-2004, and again Lebanon, the same case. This should be removed from even the list of ideas to be debated in the region, because this society, I speak about Middle East, this is always mixed. Always people live together. The problem is politicians and the role of external players. Those who are involved in this kind of conflicts, they try to play this card to divide the society more. And I think this should not be allowed by people and by intellectuals, even by politicians as well.
Well, let's get our Syrian guests' view on this. Amr, the population distribution currently stands, of course, in the way of partition, but at the same time, couldn't partition contribute to peace in Syria?
Well, for starters, you've got to appreciate that neither side are really interested in partition. I mean, the regime certainly has not entertained and is not, despite what you might hear in the rumor mill, the regime still looks at Syria and considers itself able to, regain control of the whole territory. And from the opposition side, I think they also see it pretty much the same way. So I think that's really not on the table. But there is another side to partition, and that is, in a way, how there is a de facto, if you want, partition between areas controlled by the opposition, areas controlled by the regime. That's not a sectarian partition. It's more perhaps of a military sort of geographic partition. And I think what you see, in fact, this is also partly reflected in the regime strategy, in that where the regime is putting most of its resources reflects the areas it considers to be most valuable for it and its own next foreseeable strategies. So we see the regime focusing on the main stretch of cities from Damascus to Homs to, in the Kalamun, obviously, area, Hama and Aleppo. And I think if the regime is able to stabilize this area, either through these small localized against ceasefires or direct control, then it effectively brings under its own sort of influence almost over 2/3 of Syria's population. And when you consider that Assad is planning to stand elections sometime this summer, then that to me makes sense from their position, from the regime's position, that you stabilize these areas and then you say, well, I can now hold elections. I think that's what the regime is thinking of doing right now, and that's why they're... So the process of partition is more reflective of strategies rather than partition into Alawite or Sunni or you know, along sectarian lines or anything like that. I don't think anybody's really in that
Joshua, let me get your view on also the idea of partition. And I also want to ask you, we've been talking about you know, the West, Russia and the United States, but I want to talk about the Arab countries as well and what's happening in this region right now. To what extent do you think the current rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar will have an impact on what's happening in the Syrian conflict? How will it affect, in your opinion, the Syrian opposition, which both countries have until now supported?
Well, I think first of all, that Ahmad is completely right. There is a de facto partition. It's been there for over 2 years. And we haven't mentioned the Kurds. The Kurds, of course, have carved out autonomy for themselves. They have a unified militia. They have driven off Islamist militias that have tried to take their towns and been very successful. And so we see a replay of what happened in Iraq with division. And the Kurds are intent on getting autonomy and not allowing Arabs to rule them again in the same way that they have in the past. So I believe that we're seeing a division of Syria, and nothing is going to come between it, unless, of course, I don't believe that Assad's army can reimpose rule over the entire Syria again. It doesn't have that kind of manpower, and the rebels are not winning. So we are seeing a de facto division. It's possible that the sides would become exhausted. I think Russia and Iran would accept a division of Syria as long as they have the bridge to Hezbollah and Damascus is ruled. On your second question, the international community, I think the rift between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is going to be devastating. We have seen this kind of rift happen time and time again in the opposition. The SMC, the Syrian, the military command fell into fisticuffs over leadership. Just a few days ago, Jarba, the head of the Syrian opposition coalition, was punched 3 times as he tried to separate the different actors. It's complete chaos. Saudi Arabia is trying to develop a new leadership for the Syrian rebels that sidelines the extremist groups, Nusra, and the Islamic Front to a certain degree. The Brotherhood, Saudi Arabia has just outlawed and criminalized the Muslim Brotherhood. How can you do that? The Muslim Brotherhood has won every election within the Syrian National Council and others. It's a chaos amongst the rebels. It's throwing them in complete chaos. So to have Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia working at cross purposes is only going to undermine the rebel cause.
It is a very complicated and chaotic situation. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for an interesting discussion. Joshua Landis in Oklahoma, Amr Al-Azam in Bulgaria, and here in the studio in Doha with me, Majub Zweri. Thank you all. And thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs and, of course, online at aljazeera.com. We will now leave you with a video released by the charity Save the Children to commemorate the 3rd anniversary of the Syrian conflict. 10,000 children have died in Syria, 1 million have been forced to leave their country, and 3 million are internally displaced. This video shows a second of each day in the year of a young child's life to raise awareness of what millions of children in Syria are enduring. For example, what would it be like for a British child if war came to the UK? I'm Fuli Batibo. Thank you for watching.
Happy birthday to you. Make a wish.
Granny.
Hello. Have you done your homework?
Ada.
For a general strike.
Ready or not?
Here it comes.
Violent clashes with Britain.
Live ammunition against...
Deserve to get shot.
Have a nice day, Mum.
Airstrikes on rebel position.
We are going to stay.
What's happening?
Go.
Trend.